This is Radio VR. I'm Kels Hetherington in Washington. Joining us on the phone to discuss his article on the Ukrainian crisis is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. He is chairman of the Institute for Political Economy. Dr. Roberts, in his article, writes, Washington has won the propaganda war against Russia everywhere except in Ukraine or in Russia. This is clearly a perspective that has gotten short shift in the Western media, so we very much appreciate your coming on the radio, Dr. Roberts, to talk with us about this.
Pleased to be with you.
Well, I was interested in your article. You say that the people in Ukraine are worse off today than they were before the most recent revolution in Ukraine, when their democratically elected government was toppled. Can you tell us a little bit more about why they're worse off than they were before the revolution?
Well, for a number of reasons. Principally, they're worse off because the fledgling democracy, which was trying to put down roots, was overthrown with violence, and an imposed government selected by Washington was put in office. So this does not establish a good precedent for democratic processes. In fact, it establishes the precedent for overthrowing governments with coups. So that is a serious blow to the prospect of any democracy in Ukraine. It'll be much harder now for democracy to take root. If they were unhappy with the government, they have an election coming up later this year, and they could have changed the government following the rules and procedures of democracy and the Constitution. So the interference by Washington in sponsoring a coup has really set back democracy in Ukraine. Now, there are many other ways they're worse off. The coup unleashed a tightly organized group of ultra-nationalists who now are challenging the American-imposed government, are bringing threats against the Russian residents of Ukraine, already having caused Crimea to leave and rejoin Russia, but also producing demands for separation in eastern Ukraine from the Russian cities. So there's more mischief to come, more trouble, more strife. If these Russian protesters are put down with force, it puts more pressure on the Russian government to come to their aid, and the consequences of that are unknown.
Well, let me just jump in here and ask this question. You say that the Americans actually fomented this revolution to put in place their own puppet government. We're not hearing much in the West, actually, about how that was achieved, the Americans doing this. How did Washington impose its will on Ukraine?
Well, it's all been made perfectly clear in the various leaked conversations, such as between the American Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, and the American ambassador in Kiev, where they're discussing on the telephone who they're going to put in office as soon as they've overthrown the elected government. We have also Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland's speech at the National Press Club in Washington last December, in which she boasted that Washington had spent $5 billion creating allies among and dissident groups in Ukraine. These were the groups that were sent into the protest when the Ukrainian government refused the invitation to join the EU. So what this is all about, it's to grab Ukraine, to put it in the EU. Washington previously tried 10 years ago with the 2004 Orange Revolution that this was orchestrated and financed by Washington, but it failed to deliver the Ukraine. The reason Washington wants Ukraine is to evict They wanted to evict Russia from its Black Sea naval base so that it could end Russia's presence in the Mediterranean. And it intends to put American missile bases on Russia's border with Ukraine.
Dr. Roberts, they've already said they weren't going to do that in Poland. It had been planned as part of NATO's expansion. And I'm not defending the United States, but I'm just positing that question because the United States has withdrawn that policy in Poland. So what makes you so sure they would be doing the same when it comes to Ukraine if it were to join NATO?
Look, first of all, they haven't withdrawn this from Poland. Most certainly have not. And they even built the radar bases for it already in Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, is it now? No. It's because of the neoconservative ideology of U.S. world hegemony. We are the chosen people, the indispensable people. History chose us. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it proved there's no alternative to American democratic capitalism, and therefore we not only have the right, but the responsibility to impose this on the world. This is all in the neoconservative doctrine. You can read them. They're all available online, all of their position papers, all of their arguments. And this is the basic formation of U.S. foreign policy. It started in the latter years of the Clinton regime when they attacked Serbia and separated Kosovo from Serbia. It's been going on the entirety of the 21st century. Afghanistan, Iraq.
Why would the U.S. and Britain...
Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, Somalia.
So there are a lot of examples.
I mean, how much evidence do you need? This is a war-mongering state that attacks other countries, destroys them on the basis of total lies. How much evidence do you have to have before you see what's going on in front of your eyes?
I understand, sir, and I'm not questioning it. I'm just trying to elicit the facts so that we can bring this to our listeners. Why would the U.S. and Britain have chosen right now to try to reorganize Ukraine? Don't they have enough on their plate when you look at Iran and the potential mess that's brewing in North Korea and the unresolved matters in places like Afghanistan? Why would the President of the United States choose right now as he's facing a difficult midterm election?
The answer is obvious. It's as clear as day. It's totally obvious. What has happened to the United States plan? It was blocked in Syria. By who? Putin. What's happened to their plan for Iran? It was again blocked by Putin, who worked out an agreement. And so they are blocked. And so what do they want to do? They want to terminate the ability of Russia to get in the way. And the way you do that is you degrade their strategic deterrent so they can't stand up to bullying. And so then Russia has to simply step aside and stop being an obstacle to American purposes in the world. So it's quite obvious. It's openly discussed like this in Washington. Everybody knows it. It's not a secret.
It seems like what's going to happen is Russia's going to get angry, and we're going to have the Cold War on our hands again. Is that a possibility?
I think what's happening is quite different. I think that Washington, which is enabled by its NATO puppets and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and its new puppet state, Georgia, which was formerly a part of Russia. What is happening is that Washington is teaching Putin that they will not work with Russia. They will not resolve anything. They demonize Russia. They demonize Putin. They ridicule him. They issue continual lies. Everyone believes the lie from Washington that Putin sent in the army and took over Crimea and annexed it. And it's an absolute blatant lie, but everybody believes it. So they're creating war propaganda. They're creating attitudes in the Western public that can lead to war. And they're convincing Putin that no one will listen to him, that Russian concerns are not important to the West, that the West brings difficulties and then blames Russia.
All right, so how is this all going to end? Russia is going to respond somehow. You say war.
Either Russia will surrender or they'll be forced into a war.
I mean,
the only hope is that at some point the Germans realize that this is not in their interest and they cease cooperating with Washington. If they do that, then it breaks up NATO. There can't be a NATO without Germany. And if it breaks up NATO, then that kind of takes away the cover Washington needs to pursue this policy. So there's always some hope at some point that the countries in Europe that serve as cover for Washington will come to the conclusion that this is not in their interest and that they cannot any longer enable this policy by Washington. Another possibility is that the extraordinary printing of the U.S. dollar over the last 5 or 6 years by the Federal Reserve in order to keep a few large banks afloat, that this somehow undermines currency, and a substantial decline in the dollar would break its role as world reserve currency. And with the loss of that, you would lose a great deal of American power, and certainly its financial hegemony would disappear. And this would present Washington for the first time with a budget constraint.
Wouldn't the easiest thing for Putin to do at this point be to shut off the natural gas? And he's talking about maybe doing this. They're threatening at this point. But to actually follow through on the threat of cutting off the natural gas flowing to Europe through Ukraine?
No, I don't think that Putin would do that or that he should do that. This is what the idiots in Washington are likely to do with sanctions, because they will say you can't do business with a Russian gas company, or Washington will sanction you. So what this would mean is Germany would lose about 1/3 of its natural gas, which would have devastating effect on German industry. If it was wintertime, it would have devastating effects on the German population. And so the sanctions that Washington impose would do the damage, and therefore Putin isn't responsible. But the damage happens because of America. I think Putin has got enough sense to see that, and he's not confrontational. He's very low-key. He puts up with all the provocations, and he keeps waiting for somebody in Europe to see that this is not in Europe's interest, and to leave the show, and that's what his hopes are, I think.
Now, so Europe and the United States are allied at the moment. What about China? How is China looking at the situation that is brewing and unfolding between the United States, Europe, and Russia?
Well, from what I can tell, China realizes it has the same enemy that Russia has, and that's Washington. China sees Washington building new air and new naval bases to surround China and control the flow of resources in the South China Sea. They know this is directed at them, just as Russia knows that the various color revolutions in former Russian territories, the putting Eastern Europe into NATO, they know that this is directed at Russia. And so both countries can see the aggressive militarist moves being made against them by Washington.
So is it possible that we see an alliance between Russia and China?
Well, I think there already is one, and it may take a stronger or firmer stance, but I think there already is this alliance. And you also have the economic alliance forming among the BRICS, which is Russia, China, Brazil, India, South Africa. And they intend to move toward their own monetary system, leaving that of the U.S. dollar. So I think most of these sanctions, if they become effective, I mean, so far the sanctions against Russia are meaningless. They don't do anything. But if they actually put the kinds of sanctions against Russia that they've put against Iran, I think it will, in many ways, backfire on Washington because it will hurt NATO countries, and it will also encourage more progress, more speed of the BRICS moving toward an independent monetary system. So these things can backfire on the United States and actually break up its plan to establish hedge enemy just because it creates countervailing powers.
Well, you've given us some real insights, Dr. Roberts, and I appreciate your coming on the radio and talking with us.
You're welcome.
That was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts talking with us about the situation in Ukraine. I'm Kels Hetherington for Radio VR in Washington.